Hello, my name is Anne-Marie Cannon, and I'm the host of Armchair Historians. What's your favorite history? Each episode begins with this one question. Our guests come from all walks of life. YouTube celebrities, comedians, historians, even neighbors from the small mountain community that I live in. They're people who love history and get really excited about a particular time, place, or person from our distant or not so distant past. The jumping off point is the place where they became curious, then entered the rabbit hole into discovery. Fueled by an unrelenting need to know more, we look at history through the filter of other people's eyes. Armchair Historians is a Belgian Rabbit production. Stay up to date with us through Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Wherever you listen to your podcast, that is where you'll find us. Armchair Historians is an independent, commercial-free podcast. If you'd like to support the show and keep it ad-free, you can buy us a cup of coffee through Ko-fi, or you can become a patron through Patreon. Links to both in the episode notes. Hello, fellow armchair historians. It's been a while since last we met here, and that's because I recently took a long, much-needed cross-country road trip in which I reconnected with family and friends. It was so good to see and be in the space of some of the people I love the most. I also used the 40-hour round-trip drive to catch up on my favorite podcasts, some of my faves being Civics and Coffee, Care More Be Better, Ye Old Crime Podcast, and Horrifying History, just to name a few. Check out the episode notes to see a list of other podcast recommendations. Another highlight of the trip was helping my daughter get settled in her new house in a new town, which has an amazing historical backstory, and bonding with my grandpuppy Wiley. He's a good dog. Anyway, I'm glad to be back in this space connecting with you. I have some really interesting guests coming up in the near future and have begun laying down the groundwork for our first limited series about 19th century enigmatic entrepreneur extraordinaire Charles H. Utter, a.k.a. Colorado Charlie. Stay updated on all things Armchair Historians through our social media. You can find us on Twitter at username ArmchairHistor1, on Instagram at Armchair Historians, and on Facebook at Armchair Historians. In this episode, I interview memoirist and award-winning poet Jason Sommer. Now, Jason is the author of 5 poetry collections, most recently Portulans in the University of Chicago's Phoenix Poets series. Today, however, Jason talks to me about his beautifully written new memoir, Shmuel's Bridge, which will be released March 1st of this year. It is currently available for pre-order. Against the backdrop of the Holocaust, Shmuel's Bridge sees history through a double lens, the memories of a growing son's complex relationship with his father, and the meditations of that son who, now grown, finds himself caring for a man losing all connection to a past that must not be forgotten. Jason Sommer, welcome to Armchair Historians. Thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So we're just going to start out with the question and see where we go. I do want to tell you that I did start reading the book, and it's beautiful. You are obviously a poet, the way you write. So let's just get into the question. What's your favorite history that we're going to be talking about today?
Well, the history that we'll be talking about makes the question of favorite a little difficult. It's the history of the Holocaust as background to a memoir, a prose memoir that I've written. Nobody gets driven away quite as thoroughly as when you mention poetry. And it's not a poem, it's a memoir that, for the background of which is my father's Holocaust story and the Holocaust stories of my family. It's a history that I wouldn't call favorite, but seems assigned to me by my background, essentially. I've embraced an interest in it and tried to immerse myself somewhat in it. I'm not an expert, but I've educated myself with regard to my family's story anyhow.
So, and you have a book that is coming out or just came out?
Out March 1st. called
Okay.
Shmuel's Bridge. Yeah.
Shmuel's Bridge. So I think we're going to be talking about the book and the memoir. Like I said, I started reading it. I don't know what happens to Shmuel, so I'm really curious, and I know that has a lot to do with the book. But like I said, the way you write, there's so many layers in each word and each sentence, and it's really beautifully written.
Well,
So
thank you.
with that, let's talk about why is the name of the book Shmuel's Bridge?
Well, Shmuel is my father's youngest brother. He had two brothers, and Shmuel made an escape attempt from a transport to Auschwitz, a train transport from his hometown Munkach to Auschwitz. And the book, it's at the center of the book. It's my father's deepest grief about the Holocaust, despite all that my father suffered. Dad's biggest wound really is the loss of his kid brother. We attempted to find the place where Shmuel made his escape attempt. It was a way for me to give my father something it's a complicated gift, anything with the Holocaust is, but to contribute in some way to my father's understanding of what happened there, and to also honor the memory by trying to go there and be at that place and be more closely associated in some way with what happened to Shmuel. It was also on a trip to Eastern Europe that was originally designed for me to visit the places of my father's Holocaust and his hometown, his home village, which is outside Munkach, which is now in the Ukraine. It's a much traveled city in the sense that it's now in the Ukraine. It was Austro-Hungary. It was Czechoslovakia for a time. Then it was given to Hungary post World War I as part of the redrawing of the boundaries of Europe. And we essentially followed the tracks from Munkach to Auschwitz and visited other places too, including where my father was interned, labor camp, forced labor, slave labor, and traversed also some of the places he traveled when the Russians liberated him. He was a reluctant volunteer in the Russian army and traversed what was then Czechoslovakia, Slovakia, and the Czech Republic now. In 2001, so it's quite some time ago.
Well, I can, in ways I can relate with this. My mother was born in Belgium, and in World War I, her family was executed by the Germans. She wasn't Jewish, but then in World War II, when she's 8 years old, the Germans are coming again after what they called the Rape of Belgium. And we went back in 2012, kind of similar, but different. And we went to the different places that they were on. The legend is the last train leaving Belgium. We went to all those places. And so I understand that. And the book and the concept really resonates with me. Now, it's interesting because it's a memoir from two perspectives. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I'm anxious that it not be mistaken for a biography of my father, because
Right.
in fact it's a memoir, and it's about fathers and sons, or this son and that father, who is going to be 99 in the coming year.
And he's still with us.
He is still with us. He is still with us. Part of the impetus of the book, as you know from the beginning, is preserving the memory because his memory is now going. There was some extra urgency to getting this stuff down. Not that he consulted all that much with this, but he's here still. And watching what happens to memories in the memory of the Holocaust, what I think of as the mortality, not of just of us, but the mortality of our memories, which are breakable. It's the story of living with those stories and what one does with them. part of my eagerness, or I don't know what to call it, my drive really to find the place that Shmuel died, was also to not be just the recipient of story all the time. It's a kind of a mixed motivation that I find in myself, being so much in a generation that had it much softer. I mean, every generation had it much softer than the people who'd gone through the Holocaust, but wanting to assume a kind of majority of my own so that I could do some research and I could lead the way in a way to that place. So it was an exchange of a gift for the pain of memory and on my father's part, but it also was an effort to be an adult with him. It's very hard to be an adult when the experience across the way from you makes your life seem less, in some way, less authentic, certainly less full of challenge. I mean, my father's a figure. He escaped, he was in the Russian army, and he came to the United States with an incomplete education, not even completed in terms of elementary school. And he ended up 2 master's degrees, ABD, and National Teacher of the Year. He always wanted to teach, and he knows many languages, 10 languages. And he had many opportunities to do other things. But he wanted to be a teacher and became a superb one by anybody's standards.
Now, you didn't set out to write this memoir, I think I read. How did that come about? How did you move into this?
I had been writing poems, narrative poems with stories about my father's experience and my aunt's experience. She's an Auschwitz survivor. And just the dynamic of my aunt refused to speak. And my father always spoke about it, or very, very soon in my childhood, I remember him being much more explicit, and my aunt cutting off conversation utterly. So it was a long process that involved a lot of writing. But then as my father's memory began to go, I thought, no, this shouldn't vanish, nor should the contest with it, the struggle with it, vanish. And so one thing that I represent in the book is not just the preservation of the memory, but the cost of all of that. And, not poor me, but the cost in looking at these things really hard, and what you get for that in terms of an understanding, of history, but also of the way history impacts on the most personal relationships that you can have with your mother, with your father. So it's history and right down to the granular level. Yeah.
Right. Oh, it is. And I have a belief that we carry our history in our DNA. And I know when I went back to these places with my mother where they got on the last train, where she walked to the train station under German artillery fire. And when we went to the place where the monument to her First World War relatives who were executed were, there was a healing inside of me. And I don't know if you experienced this. There was a healing in the sense of recognizing in a way that you can't even put into words how I carry that inside of me through being raised by my mother, whatever DNA memory I have. And even though it's uncomfortable and painful to go back and look at those things, I also felt that my mother, who was a very difficult person to have as a mother, I saw something happen inside of her that was, I believe it was like a healing. It was a return to where she lost her innocence at the age of 8. And I'm wondering if you had any of those experiences in your journey, in your experience with your dad.
Much of the journey was about getting closer to him, getting past the story by getting through the story in a much more proximate way than I could before. I had refused the opportunity when it presented itself earlier. The town was cut off by the Soviet Union because it had some military installations in it, factory for armament, and more importantly, a radar station of some sort. So he couldn't go back. He couldn't go back to see his mother's grave. And he wanted me to come with him when I felt able to, I could. When I felt I had enough life under me and enough accomplishments so that I felt I could enter again to this large life that was near mine, so near mine. And so there were a number of episodes where, at his mother's grave, with his son, at his labor camp, where he thought he wouldn't get out of that. Areas that he had traveled through where his life was under threat, and the bridge itself, which I don't know whether I should hold back. It's a moment of climax in the book. Do I give the game away?
No, don't give it away. Don't give it away, because I'm in the middle of reading it. I'm invested, and I want to know what happens. I know that something important happens there. So,
well, something important happens all along the way. And there's a particular vulnerability in my father. He began to tell the story in his life. He had a public forum after a while. He was appointed by President Reagan to the Excellence Commission. And he spoke about the Holocaust to larger audiences than just the family. And there becomes a kind of, both for the survivor and I think the survivor's family, there's a kind of a covering that, the story gets to be, if not rote, then practiced in some way, so that they can bear telling it. And there's a way to consider the audience, so it's not so abject, so it's not so horrible. And in that way, the stories get remote, or they're withdrawn a step or two, and we closed in on the story, and we're willing, both of us from either side, to do that. And we got closer. We buried some of the difficulties that always come with families that have these terrible events in them. There's trauma. And I don't know whether it's DNA, forgive me, I shouldn't disagree with the host, but I certainly, I think the stories that are told and the aura around a family of fear, of sniffing the air for danger, it is there and needs to be accounted for. The stories are in part that, but also needs to be settled with in some way. And we did some of that, though it was painful to be in that place with my father, in those places. And I was afraid always that I would fail him, that I would not be enough of comfort. Though my very being, in a kind of way, is seen by my father as a kind of a triumph. People tried to kill him, tried to ensure there would be no progeny, there would be no future for him. And he made a future in America. So having me at my grandmother's grave was something for both of us. By all reckonings, he should not have been able to be there or anywhere. But he was lucky, and also, he talks about his luck all the time. And luck is a big part of things with survivors. But there's something about my father. He's got real pluck to go with his luck, and his languages.
Did he end up in Auschwitz?
He did not. He did not. He had gone to Budapest, where the roundups of the Jews happened later. The country that the Hungarians controlled got roundups much earlier. And, in 1944, they killed, from the countryside, around 440,000 Jews in about 8 weeks. That was the great period of spring, summer 44, where the transports went to Auschwitz nonstop. They, war materials were, set aside for those transports. And of course, the Hungarians were assiduous in rounding up the Jews. They had a long history of anti-Semitism, coeval in both senses with the Germans. They were German allies. And even before the Germans occupied Hungary, there were pogroms, and the deportations happened under the impetus. The mass deportations happened more under the impetus of the Germans when the Germans took over in March 1944. They occupied Hungary because their armies had been beaten badly, and they were looking to sue for peace. And the Germans weren't having that. I'm sorry, I forgot the question.
I don't know, but I was with you the whole way.
Okay.
I asked you if Dad ended up in Auschwitz, and you said he
did.
Oh, that was it.
He was interned in there was something called the labor battalions, which were ways for chiefly the Jews, politically unreliables, to be pressed into service, and they were quite brutal situations. And my father was in several camps, slave labor camps, and ended up in a place outside of Budapest called Csepel, which was a major industrial complex. He escaped because he thought, just by the treatment they were getting, he thought that it was not going to end well. And my father had a tough childhood in a small village outside of Munkac, and he often said, the lack of calories affected me less than a lot of other people there because I was used to the lack of calories, And so he escaped with a friend of his and went on the run. So he missed the deportations, not by a lot, from that Csepel Island, which is just outside of Budapest. There were deportations. I can't remember the exact date, but he got out ahead of them, hid out. He was supposed to have a hiding place, but it fell through. And the friend with whom he escaped was hidden, and he was just on the run and hid out as a Gentile. Just, had a very omnivorous Holocaust experience, and so many close calls. It's kind of silly that we're both still, but we're both here, But it was. It was an experience that was labor camp rather than death camp, which was very different, but depended on who was in charge of very locally. If you had a guard who was very anti-Semitic and cared more about harming Jews than getting the labor done, you were in trouble. And escapes were dealt with by execution.
Your dad was how old when the war broke out?
He was in his late teens, 19 or so. Depends when the war, 39, yeah. You're on 19 or so.
Well, a lot of things led up to it, though. It started earlier for the Jews.
Right.
So that's the other thing. I'm thinking about this other person that I interviewed about her grandfather. I can't remember his name. There was something that she talked about was that her grandfather, he was on the run, the whole thing, but he was a young man and he was strong. And so he was able to be used as labor. And a lot of times that saved his skin. He did end up in Auschwitz, but he survived. But I thought that was interesting when you were talking about your dad and his strength. And he was already used to living on few calories, like you put it.
He was also, he had been apprenticed quite early, 14, I think, or 13 or 14, to a bike mechanic, and he could weld well. And he also spoke several languages, which saved him, lots of difficulties, but made the Russians tremendously interested in him. So when they essentially saved his life, they also, a little bit later on, decided he needed to serve with them. It was interesting to pass through that landscape with him, where he had, crisscrossed as a soldier for those months in the Russian army, and we had to cross a border at one point, and our papers were not in order, and we were stuck between Poland and Slovakia. The fellow that was driving us could not go across, and we couldn't get further. We had to find transport there, and it was very awkward. And I saw for the first time at that moment the extent of the fear he had of not just the social breakdown. He was, in a way, he'd spoken about when everything came apart, there was opportunity for him to escape, to keep on the run. But when the soldiers at the border, said, these are the rules, you will not go further, I never experienced before my father's almost dissolution into fear. Here were soldiers who were not letting him, and there was a terrible trauma was revisited. I think he had snuck over borders. He was afraid of it. It was shattering for me. I was used to him being afraid sometimes, and he certainly, through my childhood, I remember him waking up, unable to sleep, and the night was busy sometimes in my house, and also the anger that would burst from him. He seemed to be, even when I didn't understand quite what it was, he seemed marked in some way, scarred, and the trip allowed me to view that at certain points fairly closely in ways that I hadn't before. And it shook me, even as, I was a middle-aged man. And still there was something very deep that got stirred in me in response to what was stirred in him.
Wow, that's really profound. Why is this history important?
Well, we're a day away from, Holocaust Remembrance Day. And though I don't believe telling the story prevents everything or most things, keeping these stories alive, especially, I think, this will sound like justifying writing the book that I wrote, but especially to show how it impacts relations and that it's carried for generations. It needs to be remembered, not because it's remote in history, but because it ripples on, and you want some of the ripples to be cautionary to people. Be careful of your democracy. Be careful of the whisper of racism, because it soon gets large when it's allowed to whisper on. And we're in the midst of all that kind of thing here, and I guess I wanted to make some contribution to that. I tend to be skeptical about what it does. I hope it does something telling the story. I kind of think of the stories as a kind of net. Everyone who has them should tell them, because they'll catch us before we fall through to the abyss. Maybe. I was interested in you talking about the language of the book, which I took some care with. I write poems, and poems are as much about that, getting it right in language and in a concentrated space. And I hope the language of the telling, compensation is not the right word, but allows a different experience that's not just of horror, or horror recounted. But, my father made something of a life, that they tried to take it away, the Nazis, and he made something good out of it. Even in the telling of the experience, I wanted to make something good out of it, even in the writing itself, to get closer to the emotion of things, but also to show what language needs to be able to do. I'm always trying to do that. What it needs to be able to carry in a way that's itself memorable.
When you talk about your childhood and, the different levels of awareness, your friend who you were friends with, and then he found out, he was at that age, and he found out that you were Jewish, and, what happened in that relationship, the way that you describe it, I mean, I don't know how to put this, but It was almost as if I wasn't reading a book, but I was there. And that's what I'm trying to say about the way that you write, is that I could feel the different layers of what was going on. And it was enlightening, in that way, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Well, that's nice. That's lovely to hear. The incident that you're talking about, the young man, my childhood buddy, knew I was Jewish, but he hadn't gathered from his parents what that meant. And, we did this calculus where he found out that Jesus was Jewish. It wasn't the first thing he found out of Jesus. He went to Catholic school and I went to yeshiva. So I had my own take on things. But since Jesus was Jewish, we figured, as kids will, as young children will, that at some point along the way, his family must have been Jewish, since they're Catholic now, and since Jesus was Jewish, there was some sort of conversion experience. Now, my take on things was that he brought that home to the family, and they were not altogether pleased with it. The little known fact is that West Side Story was originally set between Jews and Irish. That's my story. I was raised in the Bronx. The area of conflict in my neighborhood was, working class neighborhood. There were immigrants of all kinds, but it was the Irish had been there first and were concerned to keep their turf. So there was a fair amount of friction, and some anti-Semitism including some violence that really upset my father. He didn't think it was coming again, but he was distressed to find it in America, for which he had so much hope, about which he had so much hope, and got so much from the country.
Yeah. The book comes out in March 1st.
Yes.
Where can we find your book when it comes out?
Well, your local bookstore, I hope, and ordering through your local bookstore. Mine here is Left Bank Books, but it'll be widely available everywhere. Charlesbridge, Imagine Books from Charlesbridge gets sold. It'll be on the major outlets online as well. I
but
think.
Your plug is for the indie bookstores.
Yeah, it is for the indie bookstores, because God, where would we be without them? I mean, in our local spaces, and what happens to local spaces? So yes, I did plug my local bookstore.
If there was one thing that you would want my listeners to remember about this history, or to know about this history, what would it be?
I would want readers to take away, I think, just the grainy particulars of the history. That history needs to be sunk into to really be understood. That very few people know really. I mean, the awareness of the Holocaust itself has been declining according to studies. But the idea that the Hungarians were, on this side were allied with the Germans. Right now, Orban, the premier of Hungary, is busy erasing the history. And I don't think history repeats itself exactly, but you need to sift it carefully to find out what does get repeated and what the dictator's playbook is. And I'd have my readers just to take a general sense of attentiveness to what can happen almost anywhere, but particularly, to guard against those hatreds, and to understand how history impacts the personal. You can't, we don't deal with each other through history always, but there's that background. I don't want it to drown out the personal. But I think as a background, and the history as the idea of history as ascertainable truth, or that delta situation where you eliminate what errors you can to get at as close to the truth as you can, even if that truth is uncomfortable. It needs air and light. And I hope my book lends a little air and light, not to the history, but to the impact on the persons and about something about fathers and sons, I think will resonate with everybody who is a father or a son or is around them. I don't mean to exclude anybody. I don't know whether that's a good enough answer for the takeaway of the book.
Oh, there's no right answer. It's just what you think, and that's it. Like I said early in the interview, that it's a book from your perspective, but it's a book about your father. It's a personal take on what it was to be his son, what the stories were. There's a lot of levels to the book, and it's, like I said, it's beautifully written. So is there anything I didn't ask you that you wanted to share with my audience?
No, I guess I just emphasize that it's so much about a father and a son against the backdrop of history. It isn't really a history of the Hungarian Holocaust, though that enters into it. And I guess a history of what it is to live with story. So many people do. Anybody who's had parents who've had it as you have, parents who've had a harder time than you, to live authentically with and against that deeply disturbing experience that may impact on a family life. And how I think my book in the end shows that you can, with effort, get over that, get through it, which is, I don't know, the message of hope in the book.
Well, yeah, I think the way to get over it is to go through it and to really look at it. My mother, when we were younger, she was like, that is in the past, because she had a very thick French accent. And she wouldn't talk about it. And then I don't know what broke open in her. Eventually, she did start talking about it. And she got backlash from her brother about talking about it. So there's all those things. And we were in a place called La Roche-sur-Yon, which is where they ended up in the refugee camp in France when they left Belgium. And I was interviewing her in front of a patisserie it was still a patisserie in 2012. And, I was interviewing her, and then this woman walked by and my mother got really quiet. And I'm like, she stopped in mid-sentence, and I saw that, fear in her face, discomfort. And it was that moment where she's like, oh, that woman is, I didn't want to upset her by talking about the war. And so, and even getting my mother to talk about it and to do this was like pulling teeth at times. But I kept telling her mom, and she passed away in 2017.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry that she passed before I was able to complete this documentary, which she eventually got on board with. I told her, I kept saying, Mom, your people, your generation, she was 8 when the war broke out, I said, are dying out, and we need to know the story. You need to tell me the story. I need to know the story so that we can, as you said, is it a cautionary tale? Maybe, but it's also about the different levels of humanness and how we survive. And I mean, there's just so many things when you think about your father and how he survived, and the fact that his survival made it possible for you to be here talking to me today. I always marvel at that with anybody, is that fact that all that it took for us to be here today in all those people's lives and what they had to deal with and how they survived. I mean, and I think your book it does all that. It does all that.
Well, thanks again. That it's extraordinary to think about the narrow moments that our progenitors pass through that allow us to be. It's extraordinary, really extraordinary. How, a little move left or right, and I wouldn't be here, or in my current version. Anyhow, yeah. I was put in mind when we traveled to his home village, we actually found somebody who knew his family, who knew his father and mother, a very old man. He had a perfectly pleasant conversation with this guy. And then we walked away, and I realized that the man there was an exchange of information, including the fact he'd remembered my father's brothers and his brother Shmuel, and asked about him. And my father said he died. he was killed by the Germans. And you know, it was, but walking away, I thought, well, the man was another ethnic. He was a Ukrainian speaker, Rus, or Ruthenian. You know, that was another ethnic fragment that ranged against the Jews. And my father was one of, I think, 2 Jewish families in that little village. And I wondered what the man, it seemed like a kind of pretense. Why would he be surprised? And as he did express surprise that Shmuel had died when so many had died. And he must have seen people carted off, because from that area, they were, you know, the Jews were ethnically cleansed. And I wondered at my father's acceptance of that social moment. It was just as your mother didn't want to disturb the person passing by. My father was much more interested in the connection and the pleasantries than he was in cutting through that to find out I wanted to know what this man knew, but I was not going to take the lead there. And I learned something about my grandfather, and I had to be content with that.
Yeah. There's a lot of nuance. There's a lot to unpack. And I'm glad that you're telling this story. I think it's important in the way that you're telling it. It's lovely. It's art. It's a lullaby into horror in a way, but also with the constant understanding of survival, because we know that you're here. We know that your dad survived. Well, and where can we find you? Do you have a website or anything like that?
I do. It's just my name, jasonsommer.com. Yeah, the book is available for pre-order too.
Well, and then the other thing I want to say is that I'm going to talk to my library about getting the book in and maybe doing a book club. I would like to say to my listeners that that's always an option, is to let your library know about the book, ask them to get it in. That's something I just recently learned you could do.
Well, thank you so much for this.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. There you have it, Jason Sommer and Shmuel's Bridge. Be sure to check out our episode notes to find out more about Jason and his new memoir. Also, you can pre-order the book from preferably your local indie bookstore or wherever you buy your books. Also, don't forget you can suggest to your library that they carry the book as well. Thanks for joining us today. Have a great week.